Various reports show that young women are voting increasingly to the left.
The gender polarisation phenomenon is very clear. In general, the left actually doesn't offer women a great deal. It's overwhelmingly girls at the absolute bottom of the socioeconomic heap who were victimised by these gangs. Lack of interest and contempt for the white working class. I think that combined with fear of looking racist explains why Rotherham happened in the first place.
The central tenets of progressive beliefs are not just anti-women, but actually extremely dangerous to women.
I would say that the people who have suffered most from transgenderism are female prisoners who've been exposed to violence of trans-identifying males in prisons.
Some of them have been killed. I wondered whether you were convinced by his arguments that civil war is actually possible in Britain.
Can we please just have some honesty about the reality that we're dealing with? There is a level of terror and paranoia which progressive politics has done a really good job of harnessing. The real rift here is between
Louise Perry, thank you so much for coming to speak with me. I am a big fan of your podcast, and we've spoken previously about your fantastic book. And you are, in my humble opinion, one of the great thinkers of our generation in Britain. And there's some sticky issues I'm hoping to get into with you in this conversation. I thought I might start with what I think is maybe the hardest question, or one that I can't quite make sense of. But to get to the question, I need to set out some premises that you may or may not agree with. So if you don't mind, we'll go through this step by step.
Go for it.
Thank you. So, various reports show that young women and women are voting increasingly to the left. It's more and more extreme. It's not just in Britain. It's in America. It's across the West. It's even in East Asia. We've seen it in South Korea and Japan. There's similar data there showing the same thing. It also seems to me that the central tenets of progressive beliefs are not just anti-women, but actually extremely dangerous to women. I'll make the case. Start with trans, for example. Not only are young women going through hormone treatment that can be extremely damaging for a long time, but it's the case if you have men performing in women's sports, that's obviously bad for women. And also it's dangerous to have men in women's private spaces. Mm-hmm. Abortion, this might be a bit more of a tricky issue. It's, of course, in the name of women's bodily autonomy, abortion rights, but it also seems to me, and perhaps this is less spoken about, that there is tremendous physical and psychological damage done by abortion. When I've spoken to women, elder women in private, they will say that it's what isn't said publicly so much is that there's a lot of the physical damage done by abortion as well as the psychological. It will last a lifetime, and then perhaps the most public, or in Britain the most obvious case of this is immigration, and it is the case that a central tenet of progressivism is kind of more open borders. Let's help the other. Let's bring them in. Let's look after them. But it's also the case that violent crime amongst immigrants is higher. You can look at by different groups. And so Afghans, for example, have a higher propensity for rape and sexual violence. Albanians have a higher propensity for burglary and different types of, let's say, drug crimes, drug gangs. And the most famous example in Britain is the ongoing Pakistani rape gang scandal, and where tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of young girls were systematically abused, raped, and in cases murdered. And so those seem to be central. And if not, they're not actually just side points. They're actually pretty fundamental to the progressive worldview, and yet it goes against women's interests. So can you square that for me? And if you disagree with any of the premise, you must say, but I can't square those two things.
Yeah, why are these turkeys voting for Christmas? I think that, so this is a really interesting question. Why? Because I completely agree with you, the gender polarisation phenomenon is very clear. There are some countries in which it's more extreme than in others. One of the interesting things is that it is so heavily affected by not just age, but also marital status. So it's among young people that we see this big divergence on one assumption between men and women. And one assumption would be that that's because of their age, it's a cohort effect, that it's because they're young and it's something about what they've experienced in education or whatever, which is plausible. But it's also true that you see in, say, the 2024 American election voting patterns, you see a massive skew between married Americans and divorced Americans. So divorced Americans, there's a much bigger gender polarization in that divorced women are voting more left and divorced men are voting more right. And there's something about marriage that makes the sexes align more politically. And actually, there are longitudinal studies of this where you look at how people's politics change over the course of their marriage. And the longer they're married, the more similar they are, which I think is so interesting. So it's probably, there could be some cohort effect. I think there's also something in there to do with men and women de-radicalizing each other when they're in that kind of intimate relationship and proximity to each other. Maybe also, married people, I guess they end up having the same interests for obvious reasons. They live in the same place. Maybe they have children who are experiencing the same things, etc. But I think there's also an extent to which men and women do not automatically understand each other psychologically. And it actually requires a degree of extended exposure to someone that you love and are deeply familiar with to understand the troubles that women face, the troubles that men face, how women view things, etc. So, if there's a political program in there, if we could make it work, just get people married and they'll stop being political extremists. This question about women, so these young single women really veering to the left, and I agree with you that in general the left actually doesn't offer women a great deal. The mass immigration point is well taken. Particularly when it comes to immigration from the Greater Middle East, where very misogynistic attitudes prevail, and we have seen those imported to this country. I would say that, in general, until now, the negative impact of that immigration pattern has been on poor girls and women.
Have you ever wondered who your great-great-great-grandparents were? Or where your great-uncles and aunts served during the wars? Or why your Auntie Anne looks a bit Chinese? Well, now you can find out. MyHeritage is the leading family history platform trusted by over 90 million users worldwide. With access to more than 36 billion historical records and cutting-edge AI tools, you can uncover the long-lost ancestors. I wasn't expecting much at first, but within minutes of signing up and entering a few details, I started uncovering amazing facts about my ancestors. I was able to trace the Marshalls back centuries in the fine county of Kent, and even further back on my nan's side in the Isle of Man, although there were some awkward surprises in there too. Turns out great-grandma Nancy was having a secret relationship with a neighbour, and the man I always thought was my great-grandpa, Tom, wasn't actually my great-grandpa at all. I couldn't believe it. My whole understanding of my family story suddenly flipped upside down. Who knew there could be so much hidden drama just a few generations back? MyHeritage didn't just show me records, it brought my history to life with enhanced photos and forgotten documents. One of my absolute favourite features is the ability to colorize, enhance, and even animate old family photos. But my favourite feature is instant discoveries. With just one click, MyHeritage automatically finds and adds entire branches to your family tree. This means that within seconds you could unlock generations of lost family history without spending hours on research. MyHeritage is offering a 14-day free trial. Click the link in the description or the pinned comment, or scan the QR code on the screen to begin. Don't wait, your story is waiting to be discovered. And don't forget, your past is just a click away. Start your 14-day free trial now by clicking the link below or scanning the QR code. Who knows what incredible stories are waiting to be uncovered.
Not on more elite girls and women. And I think that goes a very long way towards explaining the lack of alarm over it. Famously with grooming gangs in places like Rotherham. Rotherham is now sort of the word we use, right, to sum up this whole phenomenon, even though it's obviously extends well beyond that town. It's overwhelmingly girls at the absolute bottom of the socioeconomic heap who were victimised by these gangs. And I really think that one of the deepest sins in the British character is snobbery. It really is. And we sort of pretend that it's gone away because we, not least, woke progressive politics pretends to egalitarianism and so on. But actually I think that lack of interest and contempt for the white working class and the white underclass even more so, is so entrenched in the culture. And I think that combined with fear of looking racist, combined with a kind of inertia within state institutions, explains why Rotherham happened in the first place, happened for so long, is still ongoing in the abuse of these girls. So when we talk about these, let's say, elite women who are veering left, and generally those will be the loudest voices in terms of the people supporting these left-wing projects. I can think of particular public figures, people watching and listening can probably do the same thing. They're not that likely actually to be encountering the negative side effects of mass immigration, I would say, not on a personal level. And so that probably, so it can look more contrary to their interest than it is in practice, because there's that class impact. What was the first factor you just spoke about? Transgenderism. I mean, also sort of true in the sense that I would say that the people who have suffered most from transgenderism are female prisoners who've been exposed to violence of trans-identifying males in prisons.
Some of them have been killed. It's
hard to think of a worse place to be stuck with, literally trapped, imprisoned in this space with someone who is there because they committed some terrible offence, and often disproportionately likely to be sexual offences. And again, those women are kind of bottom of the heap socioeconomically. They don't, their ability to access the media or to have any kind of public voice is very limited. So I think a big part of the story is class. Having said all that, I do also think that there are certain elements of progressive ideology which appeal to women more than they appeal to men.
Which are?
The caring instinct. So women, particularly women who don't actually have their own children, often have this strong desire to care for something childlike. So, childless women treating their dogs like children is the most obvious example. I think that instinct can also be directed towards all sorts of other groups, and any kind of group that is projected politically as being vulnerable is liable to channel these maternal, to be a reservoir for these maternal feelings.
Okay.
And obviously that can vary. I mean, which group that is going to depend on
the culture of the day.
The culture of the day. And it doesn't have to be, men who've come over on small boats, right? It doesn't have to be transgender people, but that is who it's ended up being, I would say, at least in recent years. And that's something where women could change really quickly, and actually you're already seeing women changing really quickly in relation to the migrant hotels, women standing outside the hotels saying, save our children, like directing that maternal impulse towards actual children rather than towards proxy children. But it's a powerful instinct, that desire to be compassionate. And
that's the Pink Ladies movement that you're referring to.
Exactly. I mean, it's a good instinct as well. I mean, it can be misdirected very easily, but the desire to be caring and compassionate towards the vulnerable, it's a good instinct. It's just the one that can be harnessed by malign actors, or even just accidentally misdirected. Like, there doesn't have to be a conspiracy. It could just be a mistake. Okay. So that's one factor, that compassion point. The other is fear. Women are more fearful than men are in general. Women,
higher neuroticism.
Exactly. And there's quite a big gap. It emerges post-adolescence, which does suggest that it's got more to do with innate disposition than socialization. You don't see that difference in children, and then they hit puberty and sex hormones start acting on the brain, and all of a sudden you have significantly more neuroticism in teenage girls than in boys.
That seems obvious to me, because it's when the woman is able to have their child, and so needs to be more protective. A woman can't afford to have sort of false negatives when it comes to locating danger.
Right. Yeah. There's this evolutionary biologist, Joyce Benenson, who I interviewed recently, and she talks about men and women having specialized skills physically and psychologically. What men have evolved to specialize in is defending the community from attack. And you'll see this already in little boys, that they'll be obsessed with enemies and superheroes and weapons, and because they're so psychologically directed towards that communal goal that they do with other men in the community. Whereas what women have specialized in is defending children, and not necessarily from attack, but from, say, disease or from accident, or whatever, that women are the child protection specialists within any given community.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, being more neurotic than men and more risk averse than men is completely adaptive. But that again, that instinct in a political sense can be misdirected. And I'd say that probably the most common fear that you'll see among the young, in particular women who are skewing very far left, is fear of things like fascism. It's like extraordinarily hyped up fear that Donald Trump is the next Hitler and so on, which of course is another way of saying that Donald Trump is Satan, because that's how Hitler, this is Tom Holland's point, that's how Hitler and Nazism functions in contemporary Western imagination. As Satan, the purest expression of evil. So fear of fascism, fear of the whole Handmaid's Tale stuff that's grown out of Trump's election.
Can you explain that to me? I haven't actually read The Handmaid's Tale.
So I mean, the funny thing is about The Handmaid's Tale is that Margaret Atwood wrote it and has said since that she wrote it about the Iranian Revolution. That's what she was thinking of. And she wrote it, I think, fairly shortly after those events. And what she describes this, it's set in America, but she describes this future theocratic regime that's emerged in a very, very low fertility world in which most women can no longer conceive children. And then there's a small number of women who can. And they're consigned to the role of handmaids, and they're basically made to be surrogates, actually, for wealthy men. That image, and it's the TV show has generated all the imagery around it with the red outfits. And the imagery feeds off this idea of Puritans. It's supposed to be a Christian theocracy. I mean, I've personally, I see, aside from, I suppose, Roe v. Wade having been overturned, and then the decision returned to the States, I see no sign that Donald Trump has any interest in Christian theocracy. Mm-hmm. I think that actually most Christian conservatives are deeply disappointed in his lack of faith, right? He's not, I don't think he's an especially religious person. I think every indication is that he isn't. But nevertheless, the Handmaid's Tale imagery has proved very powerful, and this great fear of, next step Gilead. Gilead is this country that Atwood imagines, has been, again, extraordinarily hyped. Climate change would be another example of like deep, deep fear channeled towards this existential crisis. Again, it's not that I'm not a climate change denier. I'm not a Trump supporter even, right? Like I'm actually very, very moderate centrist on all these things. But I think that there is a level of terror and paranoia which progressive politics has done a really good job of harnessing. And I think it's not surprising that women are more susceptible to those fears than are men, given what we know about average sex differences.
So back to my original point then, if I'm understanding this, the demographic that's skewing the data that shows that women are increasingly progressives is actually the growing demographic of more educated, or basically middle to upper class women who are not getting married and not having children. And that is a ever-growing group, because the ONS data, I think we actually talked about this a couple of years ago when we last spoke, but the ONS data in the UK shows that an average woman now is not having the first child till over 30, and actually a quarter, of those women, half don't end up having children at all, or statistically that they're not having children. So that group is growing, and that's what's skewing the data. That's the demographic.
Yeah. And I think that there are things that progressive politics offers those women. Another being, so we talked about neuroticism, we talked about compassion and maternal instinct. Another factor is, I think there's a, and by no means the first to say this is cliche at this point, but there is a religious aspect to progressive politics. There's a whole theology that comes with it, which obviously does have some connection with Christianity, but then rejects Christianity in other ways. Maybe we can get into that.
Is it because they reject Christianity that it's turned into a theology? Like they need to have that spiritual dimension somehow
something to replace it. Yes, I'm sure that's a massive part of it. I think that if we've learned anything from the new atheism movement, it's that people desperately need religion of some kind. And yes, and progressive politics offers, I try and say progressive, by the way, rather than woke, because I think in general you should try and use the terminology that people will accept about themselves. And woke is so pejorative.
It used to be the word they used, but no longer.
I know, and that is actually interesting in itself, that it so quickly became pejorative. Normally when a word very quickly becomes pejorative, it's because it's actually describing something that's very unpopular. And there's a kind of democratic mechanism within the use of language that people will end up using language as they want to, and then the meaning of the words change. So yes, if you're constantly trying to play catch up, trying to stop the description for your ideology becoming pejorative, probably says something more about the ideology than anything else. But anyway, progressive politics does offer these religious, it offers a sense of meaning, it offers a sense of history having a clear shape, there being a clear story about why we are where we are and where we're going. It offers a sense of community, showing up to protests or whatever it is, and a sense of collective identity. It also offers enemies, which are very satisfying to the human mind, to have a clear opponent. Donald Trump does a fantastic job of that. He's a very richly symbolic figure. I think that obviously men and women both have that desperate desire for meaning and for something like religion in their lives. But I think that there are one of the things that we know about particularly younger women is that they tend to be the most mimetic demographic. So the most attentive to social forces around them.
And why would it be why would they have evolved for that to be a useful trait?
An interesting question. I'm not sure there's a clear answer to that, except that one of the things that women, going back to Joyce Benenson's idea of women being specialised in child protection, one of the things that you need in order to protect your child from danger in the ancestral environment, and still, because we have unusually vulnerable babies compared with other species, is allies. You need other women primarily to help you with the day-to-day care of your children. You need to have a community of other women in order to successfully protect your children. And so building coalitions with other women and being popular, basically, within your community is actually life or death. It's really important. And I think that's why young women in particular, so women who've just embarked on adulthood, would in the ancestral environment be having their first child and have suddenly entered this world of vulnerability where they're made vulnerable by their childbearing and they have this child or children to look after. They have this desperate craving, and it's a completely legitimate one, to be popular, to be part of the group, to have allies, particularly female allies, to be so socially completely secure. And one way that you can do that is by being very attentive to social cues around you. So one of the things that's interesting about teenage girls, for instance, is they're often the earliest adopters of slang. And a lot of slang comes from them because they have this genius for social attunement. And that includes picking up on language that people are using and any other kind of trend. Again, it's not a bad trait. It's not bad to be mimetic, and there's an obvious evolutionary reason for it. And also, I don't think any of us would actually want to live in a world entirely full of contrarian podcasts. Right? It is actually good for people to have a level of pro-social clubbishness and wanting to get on with people, not wanting to rock the boat all the time. That's actually fine. That's a healthy. There ought to be some healthy variation within the population, but it does mean that there's a vulnerability to, if a bad meme enters play, there's a tendency for it to whip round. And young women in particular are really intolerant of dissent in their peer groups.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, it comes from the same place, doesn't it? The wanting to have complete trust in this group, and someone who is voicing her dissent, that can be interpreted as you're not to be trusted.
Couldn't you argue that it's more useful for the group evolutionary that dissenters speak up and that the group listen to them because they might actually have information that will help protect the group further from, the vultures at the gate.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I guess there needs to be some balance there because, yes, you don't... If someone's voicing a very, very important point about some danger in your environment or whatever, then you don't want to be immediately jumping on them. And yet we do see so much intolerance so consistently.
Yeah. You've written that cancel culture is women culture.
Yeah. It's high school girl culture, isn't it?
Mm.
And I think it's important to emphasize this youth factor because I think you do see, you can see this in research, but you can also see it anecdotally that when women get older, they're less into that high school girl behaviour. It's very strongly associated with youth. But and again, it doesn't.
Why would they grow out of it?
Maybe
I can see why they grow out of it once they become married.
Yes, and they get de-radicalised. But maybe in the ancestral environment, it's just you're more vulnerable at that age. I don't know. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it does seem to be quite a consistent phenomenon, which is why, it's probably why you've seen, when it comes to transgenderism, why the women who've been most vocal in speaking out about it have been older women generally. And you might say that's because of the era that they grew up in. Maybe they have different political ideas that were inculcated in them than the younger generation. Or it might just be that this is one difference between young women and older women. That young women are more mimetic, less tolerant of dissent, more vulnerable to that kind of political wave just sweeping through, and older women less so.
Unless the older woman is divorced.
Well, yes. I don't know what divorced women think about transgenderism. That's an interesting point. They tend not to like Donald Trump, though, so maybe there's a relationship there.
You mentioned earlier that divorced women do actually then start polarising again.
Yeah, and divorced men.
Why would they diverge then towards more progressive politics?
Yeah, interesting question. I mean, yes, maybe it's the battle of the sexes playing out in politics. It could also be that there's something about people who get divorced, which is different from people who don't get divorced. They might be selected for greater polarisation for some reason. I don't know. It's an interesting question.
Yeah. You mentioned the fear of fascism, and this is something we've been exploring on the show, is the post-World War II consensus. And it seems to me that the idea that sort of everything that is against the progressive idea is fascist, and it's this false dichotomy that's been created, comes back to the lessons of, or the wrong lessons after post-World War. That there's this Karl Popper, that you're either for the open liberal society or you're for the fascist Nazi, and everything is either camp. And you brought it up, and this might be too complicated a question, but I was interested whether your work on the sexual revolution fit into that dichotomy, or whether you think that what we saw in the post-war years with the sexual liberation was in any way related to the philosophy from that post-World War II period.
I think probably yes. So given how awful the Second World War was, I guess it's not unreasonable for the people who grew up in its shadow to start being very sceptical of everything ideologically that had come before.
So that included the family. That included the nuclear family and
Christianity. And, everything.
Yeah.
And I guess that's not unreasonable. That if you're desperately wondering why has this happened and how can we stop it happening again, you might have a very antagonistic relationship with the near past, and indeed the distant past. But everything that was assumed by the people who brought that calamity on the world, maybe it is up for debate.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the problem is, though, when that antagonistic relationship becomes so entrenched that really you just see a reaction against almost everything that has come before. And sometimes quite clear. I mean, I think progressives will often phrase this quite explicitly. So the fact is what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery, right? But the fact that people in the past thought this is evidence that it's false. You often hear people saying something along those lines, and you think, why? That's not obvious to me. If anything, the fact that people have consistently thought something throughout time is evidence that it's true.
Right.
But that's not at all the assumption. That's in fact quite a strange thing to say in the current moment.
That's very interesting. You mentioned the Pink Ladies after so this is at the Epping Hotel, and this is one of several protests we saw up and down the country through the summer, although perhaps the most famous example of local communities protesting against illegal migrants being put up in local hotels. And the Pink Ladies thing seems to be interesting. You basically alluded to what I had taken of it is it's a strange sort of turning point. It seemed to me to be a bit of a turning point where women are actually now standing up against the traditional progressive line.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you shared that sort of opinion. That is it a significant moment, the Pink Ladies?
I think, again, the class factor is really strong. But
aren't the Pink Ladies more working class women?
That's what I mean.
But so it's not actually a turning point for the more progressive elite types.
Well, I guess it's a turning point in that they're more normal working class people are more confident in showing up at these protests and being very vocal. But yes, in terms of something I've noticed, if you ever watch Vox Pops at these migrant hotel protests, you can immediately tell just based on accent what side someone's on. Have you noticed?
No, I hadn't noticed that. Yeah, I'm sure that's true.
Like basically consistently. And I've noted actually is with this summer's various protests that they've disproportionately happened in ex-Cockney areas, i.e. places where people who used to live in, working class people who used to live in London have migrated to. So Essex, obviously, but also Diss in Norfolk has quite a lot of ex-Cockneys.
Let's be clear on that. These are Cockneys who have been moved from their traditional East London home out to these areas and constituencies that are further away from London.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
Yeah, I mean, displaced, there's a whole story there about why they've been displaced. And it's overwhelmingly to do with government policies, to do with housing and mass immigration.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so there's an existing resentment against the government on that basis. I think that this is quite often mistaken for a resentment against immigrants themselves. And normally that's actually not true. Obviously there are exceptions. But if you speak to the people who show up at these protests or you watch interviews with them or whatever, people will very rarely, if ever, express animosity towards immigrants themselves. Obviously towards, sex offenders in the hotels, yes. But in general, the resentment is directed towards the government and towards elite natives who are I really do think that so much of this is class war. Like, I keep going on about this because I think it's important. I think that the real rift here is between elite natives and working class natives. And working class native Londoners were displaced from London. They're not. It's worth emphasising that Essex is actually Essex is it's the place where most Cockneys ended up. And Essex is a prosperous place, is a successful place. A lot of people have actually ended up doing very well for themselves. They've got bigger houses than they would have done if they'd stayed in the East End, right? So it's not a entirely tragic story of destitution or anything like that. But it is still the case that, London is now less than a third white British.
Well, I worked in Tower Hamlets in Bow through the pandemic. Yeah. And this is an area where it was London's poorer native groups whose parents are still there to some extent, or the elder generations are still there, but the government prioritised giving council houses and homes to new incomers, particularly the Bengali population. So then a whole generation of indigenous Londoners did not have a place, so they had to move out whilst maybe their mum or grandma were still living in town. So you're suggesting that set the groundwork, that sort of set the emotional groundwork for what we're seeing play out. That's very interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
So the key legislative change that happened was in the 70s. I forget exactly the year, but there was the Housing Act, or sometime in the mid-70s. the crucial thing that happened was that, so social housing has existed. I think a lot of people overseas don't realise this. An enormous amount of London housing stock is social housing, which is to say it's subsidised housing, often much, much cheaper than market housing, which is available, which is regulated either by charities or by local authorities. So there's a centralised allocation system. And this emerged at the beginning of the 20th century as a place to house people because of slum clearances. So slums were cleared because of disease, and new buildings were created, often quite nice. Like the earliest housing estates are actually really quite nice. And they were intended always not for the poorest of the poor. They were intended for the kind of upper working class, like the respectable poor, to use Victorian terminology. And that remained, and there was a feeling that, and also the difference between market rent and social housing rent wasn't as enormous as it is now. So there wasn't as much of a disparity. But there was a feeling that you could get social housing if you had paid into the community. If you were locally respectable, you had a family, you had a job, you were deserving of this community benefit. That was how it was regarded in the old East End. And we're talking here about 30, 40% sometimes of social housing units in the inner London boroughs being social housing. And then the big change happens in the 1970s when the Housing Act changes the criteria that local authorities are supposed to use to allocate housing. And instead of having this system of local reputations and of respectable working class, the feeling of paying in. Instead, it's allocated on the basis of need. So if you're jobless, you're more likely to get a house. If you're a single mother, you're more likely to get a house. If you've just arrived as a refugee, you're more likely to get a house. And so all of a sudden, that system of paying in, a national law comes in and obliterates it. And that's when you see this wave. So in Tower Hamlets, you see this wave of, there's a great book about this called The New East End that was written by a group of academics, including Toby Young's father, Michael Young, who of course coined the term meritocracy. But they did this really in-depth study of what happened in Tower Hamlets. And yes, you ended up seeing there had already been a small community of Bengali men who'd been living in Tower Hamlets and often living in very crowded tenements. They couldn't access social housing, and working in the textile trade or in restaurants. All of a sudden, they could access social housing and they could bring their wives and their children over, and then they would bring their extended families over. And you saw this massive wave of Bengali immigrants arriving in the East End, and this was true also for other groups in other parts of London. And the Cockneys left. Quite quickly, and actually relatively peacefully. I mean, there were occasional instances of interethnic violence.
I mean, that's where the BNP started. All those pubs are the sort of BNP pubs are on that stretcher from Bow Church. Not, I think it's called St Mary's Church.
The BNP was born out of that phenomenon. Absolutely, you can still see. I wrote an article about this recently for First Things, and I went and looked at questions posed by BNP councillors to London Mayor, who at the time was Boris Johnson. And they're asking questions like, are you worried about Cockneys dying out in London? Boris Johnson says no. Are you worried about, the ethnic replacement of London's working class? Boris Johnson says no. And the BNP ended up failing in their political efforts in the East End. This is often attributed to, better arguments being made by the left. But actually, I think the reason the BNP failed is because all their voters moved. And they ended up going. So by the end of the 20th century, there'd been this enormous exodus, and now so of the white British people who remain in London, they're rich people generally. So you have London. Basically, anyone who lives in London or walks the streets of London will know this: that London is composed of affluent white people, white British people, I should say, and then a massive assortment of different other groups, some rich, some poor. But social housing stock is very disproportionately occupied by people who've arrived relatively recently. Either they've personally arrived or their parents did. But it's not occupied by Cockneys. So Cockneys have gone out to places like Essex, Norfolk, Surrey, Sussex, all of the kind of surrounding counties. And it's those places which have been most likely to see migrant hotel protests. And I don't think that's a coincidence.
Okay, so it's because those families already have a history of problems with the policies towards supporting immigration or immigrants,
Yeah.
they already have a psychological predisposition to be sensitive to such behaviour.
Yeah, and obviously that will be interpreted by the left as them being racist. I think that that's not quite right. I think what they have is an antagonistic relationship towards government policy and a feeling, which is not unfair, that the government don't really care about them, don't see their communities as worthy of protection, don't see their concerns as legitimate. And I think that's so much of what's motivating what we're seeing in British politics.
Given that Tommy Robinson has been the loudest voice on the issue of the grooming gangs, I wanted to know your thoughts on his work there.
Well, he's certainly been vindicated on the grooming gangs question. I mean, it's worth remembering that there were feminists of the left, or at least to some extent of the left. I'm thinking of Julie Bindel, who from very early on were talking about this. It wasn't the idea that this was entirely neglected by feminists, I think, is not quite true. So I think we need to tell that history carefully.
Bindel was writing about it as early as 2003, I think.
She was, I think, the first journalist to write about this, and faced opposition, unsurprisingly, from, say, The Guardian, which I think she was wanted to write about this issue for. She's commented on this many times since, including on my show. But do you remember the Islamic ray guns meme?
No.
This was the guy who I think was at a Tommy March or some similar event, and maybe he was drunk, I don't know. He was kind of slurring his words. He had a slight speech impediment, whatever it was, and he was talking in a slightly incoherent way about what sounded like Islamic ray guns. And this was clipped.
Oh, yeah. Classic.
Do you remember?
Yeah.
And this was clipped, and he was obviously very working class, right? And used to mock him and to mock everyone associated with him and with Tommy Robinson and co. for, these ridiculous oiks. They can't even say it right, you know. And I think that is a very ugly moment in this history where this was going on. I mean, this has been going on probably since the 1960s.
It's been going on earlier, actually. There's evidence. There's an anonymous Substack writer called Jacuz. I do actually know who the writer is, but I can't name them.
So do I.
Whose investigations found newspaper clippings and police reports that it goes back to the early 50s. There's newspaper clippings as early as 1955. And keep in mind that that's really the very, very beginning of South Asian immigration to Britain. So as soon as that started, there's evidence of grooming and immigrants of that background committing sexual violence against British women. So it's...
Yeah, and it has been consistently ignored by authorities for, as I said earlier, a combination, I think, of snobbery and fear of being racist. And yeah, I mean, I think it's a terrible, terrible blight on British character. I've thought about this a lot, like what is it about us that this hasn't happened in other countries? At least it hasn't happened at this kind of scale in other countries. I mean, interestingly, in Australia, so my family are Australian. My family are ex-Cockneys via Australia, or at least some of them are. And in Australia, there was the beginning of this kind of behaviour in Sydney, although it was men of Muslim Lebanese extraction who were perpetrating it, so from the greater Middle East, but not from Pakistan, as is the case here. And they targeted a combination of white Australian girls and also at least some Indigenous girls, I think. And they were swiftly stopped. Actually, the Australian authorities dealt with it really well, and they came down incredibly hard on the perpetrators. There was one instance, I think, where some of the perpetrators were given light sentences, and then that was appealed, and their sentences were times literally by a factor of 10 in terms of how long they were inside. And part of that was a consequence of maybe the Australian system being more robust for some reason. But it was also because the Cronulla riots on the beach in Sydney. I mean, this whole history might not be familiar to people outside of Australia, but there were There were race riots on the streets, on the beach in Sydney. The beach is a sacred place for Australians, right? Between white Australians and Lebanese Muslims. And
what year was that?
oh, good question. I want to say early 2000s, but I can't remember. I was a child at the time, so I have no direct memory of this. Helen Andrews wrote a superb piece about this for Compact recently, about revisiting this history. And the point she made, I think she's quite right, is that one, the Australian public took it very seriously, hence Cronulla, like the sense of public fury was intense. And also the Australian authorities took it really seriously. And as a consequence, it stopped. That there was nothing like Rotherham in Australia. And I've thought about this a lot. Like, what is it about Britain that we let this happen in a way that other countries have not let it happen? And I mean, I think, again, it comes down to class. Like, one of the differences in the Australian culture is that Australians place a real premium on egalitarianism. Not necessarily... this goes back a long way. You can see in the earliest writings for Australian settlers, there's a resistance to class deference. And something that people often say is, what's so great about Australia is you don't have to doff your cap to anyone. You don't have to take your hat off to anyone. Even though, of course, that there is income inequality and there are masters and there are servants and so on, there's less of a feeling of class hierarchies being deeply entrenched and the necessity of deference.
Is that because it was a penal colony where you had basically East End petty thieves or criminals and Irish political prisoners, and so they were all, there was a sort of egalitarian, we're all one group here. Do you think that's...
I don't know. I suspect that actually, because remembering that the number of convicts brought to Australia is quite small, I think it's more likely to be the mass movements of people that you see from sort of 1820s onwards, who are generally overwhelmingly British people, some Germans as well, and Irish, people from the British Isles, who didn't like it back home and wanted a new life for themselves. And one of the things that they spoke about wanting was escaping from the class system and making a better life for themselves and their children, having more space, having more land. Obviously at the price of Indigenous people having their land taken from them, but that's a whole other story. But I think that the reason why Australia dealt with grooming gangs and Britain didn't is because we've just not managed to let go of that feeling of actually despising the white working classes and feeling that their fears and their suffering are illegitimate.
So let's drill down that a little bit further. It's not totally apparent to me that the sort of upper classes despise the white working classes.
No, it's more like upper middle.
It's upper middle, right?
Yeah.
And you saw this really on Brexit. The sort of Remainer, it's this liberal boomer. It's the same people who are protesting against Trump. They've got the Ukraine flags and EU flags.
Yeah.
But they're not aristocracy in any sense. They're kind of this weird band of the middle classes.
Yeah, no, if anything, the aristocracy, they don't need to counter-signal against the working classes because who's
traditionally, the aristocracy and the working class have a pretty good relationship. I remember when Prince Philip died, the black cabs lined up and down the Mall in like 4 rows, the whole length of it. There's a very, and you think of Churchill when there was the anti-Churchill protests.
Or Princess Diana liked to take her kids to a cafe for like a traditional breakfast because there's no anxiety about being mistaken for being poor, like your Princess Diana, right?
But also the other way around, there doesn't seem to be any resentment. On the contrary, those guys, the football lad types were saying in Churchill, he's one of our own. Yeah. They love Winston Churchill. That was also
probably part of the affection for Boris Johnson, which might have passed now because of the Boris wave. But I think that he was able to marshal that feeling of kind of lovable old toff.
And maybe Farage is part of that as well.
I suppose so. Yeah, even though his background isn't aristocratic, but that's his persona.
Right.
Yeah.
So then it's more specific than this class is more specific.
I think so. It's the striving middle classes. It's the professional middle classes who often very, very. I say this having grown up among them, right? Like I know this class, and there's an intense anxiety about status, intense anxiety about not being mistaken for the people below you in the class hierarchy.
And they hate the class above as well. I mean, the anti-private school thing is a perfect example of this.
True.
That Labour Party are trying to push.
True.
So they're kind of.
It's a very bitter dynamic, and I mean, I really think that probably like at least half of the whole mass immigration phenomenon in Britain is explained by status anxiety, and people have done this sort of elaborate efforts to demonstrate that you're not like Tommy Robinson. Have become so absurdly intense.
But who wants to indicate that they're not like Tommy Robinson?
I guess anyone who aspires to the middle class.
Ah, I see. Okay.
So saying that you don't.
That's why it's so totemic as well.
Yeah. And that's why talking for so long, and this is still kind of true, talking about Rotherham was déclassé. It's not even that it wasn't. This is something that I think a lot of Americans didn't necessarily realise when Elon Musk brought this back to national attention at the beginning of this year. Everyone knew about this the whole time. I mean, I think there was a level of some of the most grotesque details that probably most people didn't know. And maybe the scale of it, most people didn't know. But everyone kind of knew that this was a thing. And it was just déclassé to talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Your show was, I believe, the first to push or bring to light David Betts, Professor of War in the Modern World at King's College London, and you had a viral episode about the idea of civil war in Britain, or coming to Britain. I think this is somewhat related to what we're actually been discussing. And you made him into a star because now he's doing the podcast circuit.
I made him. I can break him, Winston.
maybe this is the time to break him. I wondered whether you were convinced by his arguments that civil war is actually possible in Britain.
Yes. So the reason that I first started talking to David was after last summer's riots, after the Southport riots. And I Googled, has anyone in academia been writing about the risk of civil war in Britain? And my memory from having previously read about, because the thing that people have talked about more often and for longer is civil war in America. And I remember there was a podcast series some years ago about this possibility, which I reviewed, and I read some of the literature at the time. And the main argument that is given as to why civil war is not a risk in a country like Britain, or indeed a country like America, is that we're too old. And typically that kind of conflict happens in young societies.
We were already pretty old when we had our first civil war.
Oh, I don't mean in terms of the length of the country. I mean in terms of the population. So the average age of the population is too old. So I emailed David and basically said to you, what do you think about that argument? Because people are always saying this, and maybe in a complacent way. And I wondered if it might act as sort of a buffer, the fact that, I think the average person in this country is in their early 40s now, which is old relative to Britain of the, at the time of the First English Civil War, we were a much younger country. But at the time of the First English Civil War, we were also a country of like 5 million people. It was very much, much smaller than we are now. And therefore the absolute number of young men, obviously it's young men who actually wage these conflicts. Absolute number of young men is much larger now than it was in the 17th century. Does that not maybe suggest, I asked David, does that not suggest that we are vulnerable to this? And he said yes. And also as he's related on my show and elsewhere, a lot of what we're seeing, it can be, it may be a mistake to rely too much on historical analogy, because the precise conditions that we're experiencing now have never been experienced before. Like ever. And so it's just inherently unpredictable.
One obvious difference is that at that time, the population was armed. And this time, only the state has arms. So it's kind of hard to imagine. I mean, as we saw last summer, and we continue to see, there's definite rioting and protests that are possible. But that, to go from that to actual civil war seems like a ginormous leap that I can't actually fathom. Maybe you can, if you actually believe it, you can paint me that picture. If people aren't armed, how exactly are they going to wage war?
Well, I suppose it depends on the model of warfare that you're imagining. So sort of the pitched battles, American Civil War style, no. What David has mapped out as a plausible route by which this might happen is more to do with infrastructure attacks by guerrilla groups who don't need weapons. You can get a long way with cars, for instance, or basic tools to sabotage, say, electricity systems or gas networks or whatever it might be. And the model that he and I were both noticed before we first spoke is the Blade Runners who have been sabotaging ULEZ cameras. And that's another example of ex-Cockneys in operation. Blade Runners are ex-Cockneys. They live outside London and they commute in often as tradies to work in the capital, and they resent having to pay the ULEZ fees for their...
Too right.
Yeah, say they've got diesel vans, which they need for work, right?
Because their businesses is a precarious business to run anyway.
Yeah, and also they have an existing resentment against Sidi Khan and against the way that London's been governed. And
righteous resentment, I'd say.
And so they sabotage the cameras in order to avoid... And they've got away with it, but they've done a really good job of sabotaging this infrastructure and not being caught. You can imagine that scaled up. You don't need guns to do any of that. So it's plausible that people could certainly cause a lot of disruption without needing guns. This isn't unique to Britain. I think maybe Britain is a bit ahead. The only other country that I think is similarly at risk of this kind of escalation is probably France. But there are other countries which are experiencing pretty much exactly the same phenomena in terms of very high levels of immigration being resisted by the native working class. And this hasn't happened before. There's no direct historical analogy that we could look to for guidance.
We're much closer to something like the Lebanese Civil War. But again, there's so many dissimilarities that it's perhaps not even useful.
Or the Troubles is maybe... I think in some ways the use of the term Civil War is misleading because it makes people think of the English Civil War or the American Civil War. The Troubles might be a better kind of sub-level of... death and disorder.
So who are the sides? Who are the belligerents in this upcoming conflict?
If it is upcoming, I don't know.
I'm not totally convinced, but yeah.
The other view is that, I think obviously that we ought to take David's predictions extremely seriously. But the other view is that we're going to just see more of the same, but at a slower pace. There'll never be a great event. There'll never be this, a sudden escalation. You'll just see, we're already seeing quite significant civil disruption in terms of rioting. I mean, this summer we've not seen rioting on the scale that we saw last summer, but we have seen the widespread migrant hotel protests. We've seen the flagging phenomenon, which I think is indicative of increased sectarian tension.
Raise the colours and...
Yeah. And we've also seen there was an attack in Stevenage there was a petrol bomb thrown at men who were flagging.
Oh, I missed that.
Did you? Yeah, so there were some men who were out raising St George's crosses, and someone threw a petrol bomb at one of them, hit him in the face and hurt him quite badly. I mean, these are small, and there's been a little bit of rioting in Epping, and there's, all this stuff is small scale, massively, but I think it does indicate a level of tension which was not there, say, 10 years ago, 20 years ago.
That's absolutely the case.
So it's already the case, I think, that Britain is in a bad way.
But sorry, the tension is between whom?
Well, I think the primary tension is actually between,
as you've argued.
There's no war but the class war.
Yes.
Yeah. the primary tension is between, and a lot of this, has so much to do with your relationship to, it's not just like centuries long class tensions, it's also your relationship to the globalized economy. If you suffer economically from the mass importation of cheap labor, you vote Trump.
Yeah.
Right? It's bad for you when that happens. Whereas if you benefit from importing cheap labor, then you obviously have a completely different perspective on this.
I think your argument's been well made on the tension between the, let's say, indigenous classes of Britain.
Yeah.
But the fact is that in the riots and the examples that you're bringing up over the last 18 months, it has been between white working classes and newcomers. And we've seen sort of some of the counter-protests after Southport were Muslim groups chanting Allah Akbar. Even before Southport, there were Muslim groups after the Manchester arrest, if you remember that thing at Manchester Airport, where I guess a local, clearly an immigrant background, I'm not sure which one, there's a video they released in different stages, and it seemed like he was being mistreated. But then when you see the whole video, you realize he was the one actually instigating the violence. And then you have outside of police police station, a whole group of Muslims going Allah Akbar, chanting and throwing rocks at the police station. So it's the case that there are Muslim groups, there are white working class groups. Is this where the tension's actually going to play out in the more kinetic version of the conflict?
Presumably, yes. Although it wouldn't stay confined to that, because there are also existing tensions between different ethnic minorities, say between Indian and Pakistani groups, which have in Leicester, for instance, have already caused violence. You see this fairly frequently in London, that you'll have some event happens on the other side of the world and it provokes violence in London between different groups who have different opinions on what's happened. So it is an inherently unstable situation when you have sort of hyper-diversity,
yes,
which we have now, and which is really historically unprecedented, like really is. And I think that this is a whole thread within political discourse in this country, which just drives me insane, that the level of the sort of deliberate obtuseness of many people in media about how unprecedented our ethnic diversity is now. And people will play dumb all the time about, but what even is English? It so much reminds me of transgenderism, the debate over, but what even is a woman? But what if someone's had, XYZ procedure done? Are they still a woman? It's like, look. These things have fuzzy boundaries, right? I mean, less so with men and women, actually, the boundaries are fairly clear. But, there are intersex people. There are people who have made themselves intersex through surgery. There are people who often get mistaken for the opposite sex. Of course, there are fuzzy boundaries. Femininity and masculinity don't exactly map onto maleness and femaleness. But obviously the categories are real. And obviously when anyone is trying to tell you that the categories aren't real, despite the evidence of your own eyes, they're doing it because they have a political project in mind.
Yes.
Okay. And I think that we see the same thing when it comes to ethnicity and nationality. I just think it's absurd to say, like, Englishness doesn't exist as a category. Obviously, it has fuzzy boundaries. Obviously, people have always been intermarrying with neighbouring groups, and there have been waves of immigration. I mean, like, harshly resisted. The idea that the Normans or the Vikings arrived as like happy immigrants is obviously ridiculous. Those are invading armies. But the idea that any ethnic group is completely pure and has absolutely no relationship to any other is obviously absurd. That applies to every group, though. Why is it only this one, which we're constantly hearing, doesn't actually exist?
Yes. We hear about ethnic minorities in that term quite regularly, but the implication, of course, is that there is an ethnic majority, and which we seem to deny that exists completely.
I'm not arguing, like, making a hard case for ethno-nationalism. I'm saying, like, can we please just have some honesty about the reality that we're dealing with, which is actually that the various ethnic groups that make up the British Isles have been unusually stable compared with other countries. Pretty much 1,000 years have been very stable up until maybe the 1950s, where you're talking 99% plus. Okay. And obviously there's always been small numbers of people coming over for various reasons, and there's been more or less happy intermingling. That kind of there's so much Motte and Bailey that goes on in this argumentation that people will go from saying the existence of, say, the Huguenots in 18th century London, which is uncontested, therefore means that London has always looked as it does now, which is just stupid. It drives me crazy. It's just a dishonesty. And again, it reminds me so much of trans debate, this dishonesty and smart people pretending that they don't understand basic things because either they're trying not to get in trouble with people on their political side or because they're trying to push a political project.
Well, of course they are. Diversity is our greatest strength, is what they keep telling us.
But it's a strange thing as well at the same time. I don't have a word for this contradiction. I feel like I'm trying to think of a good term for it. But on the one hand, progressives will claim that the white working classes in particular, are deeply racist. And they always, just beneath the surface, is this kind of vitriolic racism that can be ignited at any moment. And if they are exposed to Nigel Farage or to any kind of misinformation, or if they're given the wrong guidance by media in particular, they will be ignited into violent racism. But then on the other hand, there's this feeling that that there's no point at which you're in danger of producing that kind of conflagration. You can have as much immigration as you like, as many small boats arrivals housed in hotels as you like. You can do anything. And that group of apparently racist, dangerous people will never react. That's what I find strange. Like, surely there's a threshold, yes, at which people would react. Mm-hmm. And yet it doesn't seem to factor into progressive decision-making. I really, really strongly think that actually being cautious about mass immigration is the anti-pogrom position. I thought this so much with the riots in Ballymena this summer.
In Northern Ireland.
Yeah, where you saw the original dispute between locals was between local Irish people and I think it was Roma. Well, I can't remember all the details, but there was some sexual assault case which produced these kind of tensions. What ended up happening was that completely innocent people, including, say, Filipino healthcare workers who were living in Ballymena and working there, were terrified out of their homes by mobs who showed up and they thought they were going to burn down their houses. Like, that is what happens when you permit ethnic tensions to get to that level of violence.
Yes.
And I think how reckless to produce those conditions, and actually how the people who so often suffer when that kind of conflict ignites and spirals out of control are actually ethnic minorities. I find the recklessness of it enraging, and the false stupidity of it enraging. And again, I just feel like so much of this surely comes down to people would rather make terrible decisions and promote ridiculous falsehoods than appear to be in any way associated with people like Tommy Robinson. Mm-hmm. Like, that's a worse outcome in the minds of middle-class English people.
This is not a recent thing, in my opinion. I think you can trace this all the way back to the post-war period. So 1947 is when immigration begins. And it's not huge at the beginning. Well, there's quite some numbers, particularly from Europe. Famously from Windrush, although the Windrush numbers are pretty low.
Yeah.
But within 10 years, you have the first race riots, both in Nottingham and in Notting Hill. Another 10 years, and then you have the Race Relations Act, 1967. That act is the first example that instead of trying to deal with the root causes, i.e. how to assimilate people, or maybe we calm it with the immigration, instead they're at the legislative level are trying to put laws to stop or illegalize certain behaviors. And that's just the beginning. And then that just gets turbocharged after the Stephen Lawrence murder, which is when you get non-crime hate incidents is directly a consequence of the Stephen Lawrence. And now there's like 24 of these different laws that of people trying to, instead of dealing with the root causes, immigration, or maybe cutting immigration or dealing with assimilation, they've actually just built this whole thing, which is why we have a mess now of comedians being arrested at airports.
And in a way, you have to pity the government, because actually, I'm sure there is a recognition for many people in government right now that the situation we're in is very febrile. The risk of, what I hear about what people are saying in government is they are completely aware of the risk of having more riots like Southport on a worse scale and having really serious disruption. And they feel like there's nothing that they can do, or that the only thing that they can do is to try and suppress information that might act as a trigger for that kind of rioting. But how can they? I don't think they can do that.
They've actually tried to do that. Congressman Jim Jordan revealed emails sent by Keir Starmer's government to American tech firms saying, keep an eye out on anyone who says two-tier in Britain on social media platforms. So we've got to clamp down on this. It's utterly shocking.
But
that is actually
suppress, for instance, TikTok, because that's a Chinese operated company. I don't care what it's so much like the invention of the printing press, and you suddenly have this explosion of information that's newly available to people, and governments all the time try and suppress that information, but eventually to no avail. The digital revolution is the same type of change, where there's this abundance of information, and yes, a lot of that information is poor quality, and a lot of it is false. There are false rumours spread. There've always been false rumours spread. And it's gossip in the streets is now taking place on Twitter and TikTok. But I think the governments hope that if you can only manipulate the narrative, that people will calm down, I think is a false hope.
Yeah.
One of the things that I thought was notable on this front was when you'll know, obviously, that the government took out a super injunction to hide the mass resettlement of Afghans whose identities had allegedly been leaked or had been at risk of being leaked to the Taliban. So Afghans who had collaborated with the British Army in various capacities. And they were tens of thousands of people were resettled here at enormous expense, and it was kept secret until earlier this year because of the fear. Well, the claim is it was kept secret to hide what was happening from the Taliban. I suspect, I'm not alone in this, that it was also kept secret because of a fear of what the British public would say about having to foot the bill for this, particularly because the whole reason for the project was a silly mistake.
Yes.
Made within the MOD, I think it was.
It wasn't intentional. It was a blunder, but
very
the way they
expensive.
dealt.
Yeah, the most expensive email ever sent, I think, was how the Telegraph
What was it?
described it.
It wasn't the billions, right? I've forgotten the exact number.
It was just, eye-watering sums. And this was all kept secret. But the places where the highest numbers of Afghans resettled as part of this scheme were located were also often the places which saw the worst rioting last summer. There was a correlation between how many Afghans had been resettled in an area and the likelihood of rioting, which I think reveals the fact that actually you can massage the narrative all you like. You can take out a super injunction to keep it secret what you're doing, but people still have a capacity to notice what's going on, which you can't suppress. And that's why I think the information war is going to fail from the government's perspective. But then I think, from there, this is why I say you should pity them. Like, what are they supposed to do? It's actually really difficult.
What is the solution? With the question of assimilation with all these groups who are already here, let's just take aside what we do about it, leaving aside rather what we do about illegal immigrants or the channel crossings. For the 4 million Pakistani heritage people here, that's the biggest group. I think there's a big Indian heritage group. How do we assimilate these people into the British project? What is it that unites us all? Obviously, we're different ethnicities. What is the culture? If we agree that diversity is not our greatest strength, what is the meta culture that can unite all of these different people?
I don't really know, because the thing that is periodically raised in British media is more aggressive assimilation. strategies, like, for instance, strictly enforcing people's ability to express their religious identity publicly, as in France. The French strategy, basically, is periodically raised as something that we should attempt here, which we've not attempted till now. We've been very free and easy about people's ability to express whatever identity they want publicly and to self-segregate as much as they like. But I say that hasn't worked in France.
It hasn't at all worked in France.
I mean, France is in maybe as bad a position as we're in.
Yeah, possibly. The only country that seems to have somewhat pulled this off is Singapore, where
they do it by being very authoritarian.
They have to give up on liberalism. Basically, I think their it's like 20% Muslim population, or maybe it's not that high. Maybe it's 14%, but it's much higher Muslim population than we have here in Britain. But it's not a liberal country. They're authoritarian about where different groups can live. They have enforced integration in terms of living zones. There's strict rules about what Muslims can and can't do. Muslims are treated different there, and that's the way they deal with Islamism. And as a consequence, they don't have Islamist attacks. So it seems to me that Britain has to decide whether or not it can be a liberal country anymore. And
Singapore on Thames. That's what we were promised by Leavers, right?
Yeah, quite. Well, we didn't think about it this way.
Yeah.
It was. We thought about it from the economic side, not the cultural side.
I mean, I think the big example of successful assimilation, which really looms large in the British imagination as elsewhere, is the Ellis Islanders. So the ability of America to successfully integrate primarily other European groups into what had previously been a very WASP-heavy society is often touted as an example of the incredible capacity that we have as humans to live in, to experience the melting pot. And I mean, America did do a good job in that regard, but it was in a society where there was no welfare state, really, to speak of. You showed up, and if you couldn't prosper on your own, you either slept rough or you went home. Like, those were your options. Quite a lot of people did go home. Like, a lot of Italian Americans, for instance, went home. This is quite often forgotten. There were also various teething pains for a long time, say the mafia or conflict between Irish and exactly. So it wasn't like it was super easy.
I mean, the striking difference with the American project was that they are all of the same civilization. At least they are all of quote unquote Christendom,
apart from Jewish immigrants.
Apart from the Jewish immigrants, but even then, I would argue strongly that they're part of the Judeo-Christian civilization, and that is a easier fit than those who are not from, and even the bigger. Even those who are coming from Latin America, again, they're Christians. So there's an easier fit than those who have a completely different foundational view of reality, which is what it is to have a different religion. Yeah,
I think that the Ellis Island myth has inspired complacency here. And I mean, you hear politicians all the time. Unfortunately, British people in general, and particularly I think British elites, are so Yankee-brained. Like, we're so obsessed with America that we have a tendency to assume that whatever American history consists of must be true of us as well. And so you'll hear people talk about the melting pot, for instance, in relation to Britain, which is ridiculous. Like, it's a completely different history of immigration. The nature of America is that it is an immigrant nation. Everyone there, apart from Indigenous Americans, of which there are not very many, everyone there was an immigrant at some point, and there has been a conscious process of nation forming, more or less successfully. I mean, obviously, America also has its own problems, right? To put it mildly.
Just one detail is that's if you conflate settlers with immigrants. I'm not sure they're quite exactly the same thing, but for the sake of argument, I think it still applies.
Yeah, and also, I mean, the welfare state is a really big factor here. It's completely. We've talked about social housing at length already, but the idea that anyone from, which is, I think, the Open Borders Project, that anyone in the whole world can rock up and immediately have access to the welfare state. It ought to be obvious how crazy that is, and actually how it's the left. It's actually the old left that is, I feel, most imperiled by our current politics, in the sense of the support for the welfare state and being rooted in community and all this kind of stuff, which, I have very mixed feelings about the welfare state, because I completely understand in the era in which it emerged, it's barely 100 years old, right? This is actually a very, very new
Post-war
experiment.
again, yeah.
Well, before then with the pension, but still,
Right.
this is a new thing. It was, at the time, it seemed like such a good idea. Such a good idea. In a period where, say, to be old was often to be completely destitute and to die cold and hungry. You can completely see how a society would want to do something about that. But then look at how it's spiraled.
Yeah.
And I look at how it is now at risk of bankrupting the state, and also at how the system has ended up being abused by newcomers who haven't paid in, and that this is evident to people. It's just,
and that
it's
abuse
disaster.
Creates total resentment, particularly
absolutely.
from the tax-paying classes who don't have that much money, who don't have that much, and so they feel total
It's
resentment.
so toxic. It's terrible. And I guess it's a tragic lesson in how the best of intentions can turn out really badly.
Well, on that note, I'm going to invite you for a brief conversation over on our Substack, if you don't mind, for a slightly different topic. I just wanted to ask about your time with Bonnie Blue. I know you've just interviewed, and I wanted to ask about what you think she symbolises in Britain. But before we go over there, is there anything you'd like to bring attention to listeners and viewers?
So my Substack is called Maiden Mother Matriarch. It's on everywhere you get your podcasts, and also on Substack, and I cover. So I like to say that the topics I'm interested in are birth, sex, violence, and death. So anything that comes under that category, you will find discussion of it at the MMM podcast. My first book was The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. I'm working on another book. When it will be out, I don't know, but maybe we can discuss that next time.
Well, one of the reasons
when it finally gets written.
I'd love to. And one of the reasons I think your podcast is so fantastic and your Substack is because, as everyone listening to this episode will hear, you are not remotely politically correct, and you have no problem whatsoever going to the most difficult topics and talking about them honestly, unlike our government. Louise Perry, a great pleasure.
Thank you.
Louise, welcome to the Substack. I just wanted to have a brief conversation about Bonnie Blue. I wondered what she symbolises in Britain, maybe in the West. Just for a little bit more context, I've never covered this topic on the show because I'm not interested.
The main thing I concluded from talking to her, I've spoken to and interviewed a lot of women over the years who've been involved in the sex industry in some capacity. And what they overwhelmingly say is that they found it deeply traumatic. It's not a coincidence that women in the sex industry so often have substance abuse problems and serious mental illness, and the suicide rate among porn stars is appalling, and But I don't know if that's true of Bonnie Blue. She says very insistently that she is not harmed by this, that she's fine. I think that actually she's just a really, really unusual person. I think she's being scapegoated, actually, quite substantially, because all she's doing.
Thank you for watching the Winston Marshall Show with Louise Perry. Remember to press subscribe if you want to support the show, and if you head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk, you will hear that extended conversation between me and Louise where we discuss Bonnie Blue. That's all at winstonmarshall.co.uk. But before I leave you, remember to check out today's sponsor, MyHeritage, by clicking the link in the description to start exploring your heritage today. And by supporting my sponsors, you are supporting this show. Thanks for watching, and until next time, be well.